are constantly bombarded with information, aren't you? Every single day.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about it. Articles, reports, news headlines, research papers, even just conversations. It's like a tsunami of stuff.
It really is. Information overload.
So how do you actually cut through all that noise? Grasp complex ideas quickly, really understand them at a deeper level, and maybe most importantly, actually use what you learn.
Yeah, that last part is crucial, making it actionable.
It often feels like getting a handle on this fire hose of information. It comes down to how you're processing it. Are you zeroing in on the solid facts, the things right in front of you, the concrete details?
Step back.
Exactly. Can you step back and see the patterns, the underlying structure, the connections, the bigger picture? In other words, are you thinking abstractly?
And that capacity to switch between those two modes, to see both the individual tree and the entire forest, that's incredibly fundamental. It really is.
Yeah.
To making sense of the world around us. It shapes how we learn, how we solve problems, even how we interact with other people.
And that push and pull, that difference between focusing on the here and now specifics and contemplating the broader concepts, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We are tackling the fascinating and sometimes honestly surprising difference between abstract thinking and concrete thinking.
Yeah. What does these terms really mean? Not just casually.
Exactly. We want to delve into the definitions and how do these crucial abilities develop within us over time? Is it always like a simple step-by-step progression?
Which is a really interesting question in itself.
And why are they so incredibly important for, well, pretty much everything you do? From tackling a tough problem at work to understanding why someone reacted the way they did, maybe.
Or even designing things like advanced artificial intelligence systems, as we'll see.
And critically, we'll explore the potential downsides too, won't we?
We have to. Are there times when one style of thinking, or maybe an imbalance between them, can actually hold us back?
How can thinking too abstractly, maybe getting lost up there, or even using concrete examples poorly, how can that hinder us?
Good question.
So that's the mission for this deep dive. We've pulled together a stack of fascinating material for you, exploring everything from classic developmental psychology and philosophy,
All the way to modern education research, cutting-edge studies on AI.
even insights drawn from analyzing online discussions about how people actually process information.
Right, so we're going to guide you through the core definitions, the complex story of their development, and there are some twists there. The sheer power these thinking styles give us, the potential pitfalls to watch out for, and crucially, how we can consciously bridge the gap.
How we can connect these two essential ways of seeing and processing information in our own lives and work.
So, get ready for perspectives that might, challenge some long-held assumptions about how we learn and think. We're drawing from foundational theories, but also some really interesting recent cognitive science findings.
All right, let's roll up our sleeves then. Let's unpack this, starting with the absolute basics. What are we even talking about when we use these terms, abstract and concrete? What's the core difference?
Well, on an intuitive level, it feels fairly clear, doesn't it?
I think so.
Concrete thinking. It's anchored firmly in the here and now. It's the tangible, the physical, the literal.
Okay.
It's thinking about things you can directly perceive with your senses, or things that are immediately present and specific.
Right, so it's thinking about this specific red apple sitting on this specific table, or the particular words that person just said, exactly as they were spoken.
Precisely. It's grounded in specific instances and sensory experience, tied to specific objects, events, situations.
Okay, got it. Concrete, specific, tangible, right now.
An abstract thinking, conversely, well, it transcends that immediate physical reality.
Okay, so it's stepping back.
It is. It's about dealing with ideas, concepts, qualities, relationships, possibilities, things that aren't physically present or are general rather than specific. It involves generalization, symbolism, hypothetical scenarios, things not directly tied to sensory input.
Okay, so instead of this specific red apple, it's the concept of fruit, or maybe redness. Or
Exactly.
instead of those specific words someone said, it's the underlying meaning or the intention behind them.
You've got it. It's moving from the particular to the general, or from the physical world to the conceptual world.
Right, moving up a level in a way.
And it's interesting how different fields kind of define this. The sources we looked at approach this from a couple of different angles. In philosophy, for instance, there's a deep discussion around What counts as an abstract object versus a concrete one?
Okay, yeah. Concrete objects exist in space and time, right? Like that apple or this chair or a person, a planet.
Right. They have physical properties, a location.
And abstract objects. They're things like numbers or
Yeah.
concepts like justice or maybe mathematical sets. They don't exist in that same physical way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Philosophically, things like the number 3 or the concept of justice or the set of all prime numbers, those are considered abstract objects. They don't have a location in space or time you can point to. And one source, referencing the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, actually describes abstraction using this formal, almost mathematical idea. It talks about an abstraction function.
Ooh, okay, an abstraction function. Sounds a bit technical, but how does that help us understand the difference?
Well, we don't need to get lost in the formal logic of it, but the idea behind it is actually quite intuitive and connects back nicely to the psychological view. Philosophically, this function basically works by taking a collection of things.
Like lots of different red objects.
Perfect example. Red apples, red cars, red shirts,
Yeah.
all the red things. And it groups them together based on some shared property. In this case, the property of being red. That shared property is what philosophers call an equivalence relation.
Okay, so everything in the group is equivalent in terms of its redness.
Exactly. And the result of this grouping, the common property or concept that defines the group, which is redness in our example, that is the abstraction itself, and is considered an abstract object.
So the function takes all the concrete, specific red things and maps them to this abstract concept of redness.
Precisely. It picks out the common feature. And importantly, for this philosophical view, any valid abstraction that comes out of this function has to relate back to some actual object or instance that could be mapped by it.
Meaning you can't have the abstract idea of redness floating around if nothing in the universe could possibly be red.
Right. The abstract concept is derived from concrete instances by recognizing what they share. It's a formal way of looking at it.
Okay, so that's the philosophical angle defining the abstract thing as derived from concrete things via shared properties. How does the psychological angle compare? That's more about how we think, right?
Yes, the psychological perspective focuses less on whether redness exists independently and more on the cognitive process of thinking in abstract versus concrete ways.
How our brains actually do it.
Exactly. So in psychology, concrete thinking is described as the mode where you focus on specific facts, physical objects, the immediate present, and literal meanings. It's grounded, empirical, what's right in front of you. Essential for dealing with the tangible world, paying attention to detail.
Makes sense. And abstract thinking, psychologically speaking.
Psychologically, that's the ability to go beyond that surface level physical information. It's the mental process of making generalizations, contemplating concepts not tied to specific objects or immediate senses, engaging in hypothetical reasoning, what if, thinking.
Outside the box.
That's a good way to put it.
Right.
It involves understanding intangibles, like emotions, values, symbols, recognizing broad patterns and principles that apply across different specific situations.
Okay.
And it's widely seen as more sophisticated reasoning skill because it lets us synthesize information, find deeper meaning, and integrate all the specific details into broader, more complex contexts.
So psychology defines the ability or the process of abstract thought, which seems to include that grouping and generalizing that the philosophical view tried to formalize.
It does.
It feels like both perspectives, in their own ways, are pointing to the abstract being built upon or derived from the concrete.
They really do, and that's a crucial connection. Abstract thinking in humans almost always needs a foundation of concrete understanding. You generally need to grasp what individual specific instances are, specific apples, specific interactions, specific data points.
Before you can successfully generalize about them.
Exactly. Before you can form abstract concepts like fruit or social dynamics or economic trends or theorize about how they relate, concrete thinking is usually our initial way of engaging with the world. For most learning and development, that capacity for abstract thought builds upon that concrete base.
Okay, so why is getting clear on these definitions important for you, listening right now? Why should you care about this distinction?
Well, understanding this fundamental divide is really the first step toward understanding your own cognitive toolkit. When you're faced with a new challenge, or a complex problem, or maybe just a dense piece of information, can you recognize whether your mind is naturally defaulting to focusing on the concrete details, the facts, the specifics, the tangible bits, or are you actively trying to grasp the abstract patterns, the implications, the underlying principles? Identifying how you're approaching something is crucial because the most effective strategy often depends on consciously choosing the right thinking lens for the job.
Or knowing when to switch between them.
Absolutely. It's like figuring out if you need a microscope for the details or a wide-angle lens for the landscape before you even start analyzing the picture.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's what we mean by abstract and concrete. Now let's shift gears. How do these different ways of thinking actually get built in our minds? How do these abilities develop, from childhood into adulthood?
Right. For decades, the dominant and foundational view on cognitive development, particularly looking at this progression from concrete to abstract thinking, has really been the work of the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget.
Piaget. Yeah, you can't talk about child development without talking about Piaget. He's like the bedrock.
He absolutely is. His theory described cognitive development as moving through a series of universal stages, and traditionally, it presents a pretty clear pathway from concrete ways of thinking towards increasingly abstract ones.
Okay, so take us through the relevant stages according to Piaget.
Sure. It starts with the sensorimotor stage. This is from birth to roughly age 2. And in this stage, an infant's understanding of the world is entirely concrete. It's tied purely to their immediate sensory experiences, what they see, hear, touch, taste, and their motor actions, how they move and interact physically.
So thinking is doing and perceiving, basically.
Pretty much. Their world is what they can directly engage with right now. They're absorbing concrete information through that direct engagement.
Okay, very concrete. What's next?
Then comes the pre-operational stage, typically spanning from about age 2 to 7. This is a really crucial period because symbolic thought starts to emerge. And that's foundational for abstract thinking later on.
Symbolic thought, like language and pretend play.
Exactly. Children start learning that words, pictures, even simple actions can represent things that aren't physically present.
Right, using a block as a car or understanding that the word dog stands for the furry animal.
Precisely. They're starting to grasp that one thing can stand for another, a key step towards understanding abstract symbols. They also begin to understand the basics of symbolism in language, interpreting things like facial expressions, basic emotions.
Which involves going beyond just the literal image or sound to infer an internal state, right? That feels like a step towards abstraction.
It is a step towards understanding something intangible. They also start moving towards understanding that others might see the world differently, although they're still quite egocentric. But their logical reasoning is still pretty limited, often based on intuition. They famously struggle with conservation tasks.
Ah, the conservation tasks, like pouring water between different shaped glasses.
That's the classic one. They struggle because they tend to focus on only one dimension at a time, like just the height of the water, not the width, too. Piaget called that centration.
Okay, which leads into the next stage.
Which is the concrete operational stage, generally from about age 7 to 11. Here, children develop more robust logical reasoning skills. But, and this is the key part, these skills are applied primarily to concrete objects, events, and situations, things that are present or easily imagined.
So they can think logically, but about real-world stuff.
Yes, they overcome that centration and develop decentration, so they can consider multiple dimensions at once, like both height and width in the water task. They master seriation, arranging items systematically, like sticks from shortest to longest. They understand cause and effect better, take others' perspectives more reliably.
They can recognize abstract concepts too, right? But only if they're tied to something real.
Exactly. They can grasp abstract ideas if they're grounded in empirical experience or concrete examples. But they still struggle quite a bit with purely hypothetical problems or systematic scientific thinking that requires mentally manipulating variables in the abstract, like figuring out all the factors affecting a pendulum swing without actually physically testing each one.
So logical thinking is there, but it needs that concrete anchor, reasoning about the physical world.
Precisely. And finally, according to Piaget, we reach the formal operational stage. This begins around 11 years old and continues developing into adulthood. This is where abstract thought truly matures.
Okay, this is the final step in his model.
Right. Individuals gain the capacity to use symbols to represent abstract concepts fluently. They can engage in theoretical mathematical reasoning, grapple with philosophical ideas, analyze purely hypothetical or counterfactual scenarios what-if questions.
They can discern complex patterns and relationships among abstract concepts too.
Yes, and their ability to empathize, to understand others' complex internal states and perspectives expands significantly because they can abstract away from their own experience. They can handle abstract logic puzzles, engage in systematic scientific reasoning by forming hypotheses and mentally testing variables.
So the traditional view, the Piagetian view, is this fairly clear age-linked progression, starting purely concrete, moving to symbols, then logic about concrete things, and finally, boom, mature abstract reasoning. Concrete thinking is the necessary foundation built layer by layer.
That is the canonical progression, yes. And it captures a great deal of how we see cognitive development unfold. However...
the however. I sense a twist coming.
Well, as you hinted, one of the sources presents a really interesting alternative view, or perhaps a challenge to the idea that this concrete to abstract path is the only way development proceeds, especially in certain areas of knowledge.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, potentially flipping our understanding. Tell me about this abstract to concrete shift hypothesis.
Right, this hypothesis and the research supporting it comes from psychologists Frank Keel and George Simons. They essentially question the assumption that cognitive development always moves from concrete to abstract.
Always is a strong word in science.
It is. They propose that in some specific domains of knowledge, development might actually follow the opposite trajectory, starting with an abstract framework or expectation, and only later filling in the concrete details.
Whoa, okay, that's totally counterintuitive based on everything we just discussed about Piaget. How on earth did they investigate that?
They conducted a really clever series of studies, primarily focusing on children's understanding of biology versus artifacts specifically. What kids expect the insides of animals and machines to be like.
Their expectations about insides.
Okay. So they'd show children drawings, for example, a picture of a sheep. And this sheep drawing would be presented alongside different options for its insides. Maybe realistic animal insides like bones and organs, or machine insides like gears and wires, or even just inert stuff like dirt or rocks. Then they'd ask the children, which drawing shows a real animal with real insides? Or a real machine with real insides.
So they weren't testing if the kids knew the exact anatomy, like could they label the liver?
No, not at all.
But more their fundamental expectations. Like on an abstract level, what kind of stuff belongs inside a sheep versus, say, a toy truck?
Exactly. Were their expectations abstractly different for those categories, even if they lacked the concrete knowledge of what specifically should be inside?
And what did they find?
The findings were quite striking. They found that preschool children, typically ages 3 and 4, responded very systematically based on the category of the item, animal versus machine, even though their concrete biological knowledge was extremely limited.
Limited how? What did the preschoolers actually choose for the sheep?
Well, for instance, many preschoolers, when shown the sheep drawing, were just as likely to choose the version with dirt and rocks inside as they were the version with actual animal organs.
Okay, so they didn't have the concrete knowledge that sheep have organs, not rocks.
Right. They lacked that specific concrete knowledge. However, they were significantly unlikely to choose the drawing of the sheep with machine insides the gears and wires.
So on an abstract level, they seem to know sheep shouldn't have machine parts inside. Even if they didn't concretely know, sheep should have organs inside.
Precisely that. They seem to possess an abstract expectation that animals have a fundamentally different kind of inside than machines do, even without accurate concrete knowledge of what that inside actually consists of.
And older kids.
By contrast, when they tested 8-year-old children, those kids had much more concrete and accurate expectations. They reliably chose the drawings with biologically plausible insides for animals and machine insides for machines.
And they checked this wasn't just about the drawings.
Right, they replicated the pattern using different visuals, like photos or even jars of substances representing insides, and also when emphasizing the function of the object, the pattern held. Preschoolers showed abstract category differentiation before concrete knowledge.
That's fascinating. It suggests a young child's mind isn't just this blank slate waiting to be filled with concrete facts from which they'll eventually derive abstractions.
It really does.
It hints that maybe, in some domains at least, we start with an innate or at least very early developing abstract framework, like a fundamental expectation about how certain categories of things work.
And then we fill in the concrete details and the specific mechanisms later through experience and learning.
How does this connect to other debates in cognitive development? You mentioned one earlier.
Yes, this research offers a potential new perspective on long-standing debates, like the one between researchers Susan Carey and Rochelle Gelman about whether young children have an autonomous biology.
Right, the Carey versus Gell-Mann debate. Can you quickly recap the core disagreement there?
Sure. The central question is whether young children have a distinct, domain-specific system for understanding living things in autonomous biology that's fundamentally different from how they understand physical objects, like physics, or people's minds, psychology. Now, Carey initially argued that young kids primarily apply general physical principles to living things and only gradually acquire a distinct biological framework later. Gell-Mann, on the other hand, argued for an earlier, possibly even innate skeletal understanding specific to biological things.
And the Simons and Keel findings lean towards Gell-Mann.
They seem to. The results suggest that preschoolers do have an early framework for biology that distinguishes animals from artifacts at a fundamental level. But crucially, that initial framework might be more abstract, expecting a difference in insides before it becomes concrete, knowing the specifics of that difference, like organs versus wires.
Wow. So instead of just stacking concrete blocks one by one to eventually build an abstract tower, maybe sometimes our minds put up a kind of skeletal abstract frame first.
That's a great analogy.
And then we spend time filling in the concrete details to flesh it out.
It challenges that traditional, strictly unidirectional view of concrete to abstract development. It suggests that cognitive development is perhaps more dynamic, maybe more bidirectional than we previously thought. Abstract expectations might sometimes precede concrete knowledge in certain domains.
Okay, so what does this surprising finding mean for you, thinking about your own learning process, maybe as an adult?
Well, this research invites us to question that assumption, that learning always has to start with the tangible facts first. Are there areas in your own life, maybe learning a new skill, understanding a complex system at work, grappling with a personal issue where you feel like you kind of grasp the big abstract concept, the underlying principle, but you're missing the concrete steps or specific examples?
Or the opposite, maybe. Drowning in facts, but missing the big picture?
Exactly. Or maybe you have tons of specific facts, but you haven't yet formed that abstract understanding of how they all connect. Recognizing that this non-linear development is possible, sometimes abstract first, sometimes concrete first, sometimes both interacting, might change how you approach learning new complex things.
How so?
Well, sometimes it might be better to actively seek out the abstract framework first, the overarching theory, before diving into examples. Other times, building from concrete examples might be the way to go. It just gives you a more nuanced understanding of your own learning journey and potentially more flexibility in how you approach it.
That's a really powerful insight. It seems like both the traditional view and the surprising alternative really highlight that both abstract and concrete thinking are essential, powerful tools in our toolkit.
Absolutely.
Let's talk more about that power. Why do these thinking styles matter so much, and how can we leverage them effectively?
Okay. Abstract thinking especially is widely recognized as just a cornerstone of modern human cognition. It's what enables us to navigate complexity that goes way beyond our immediate perception.
Give me some examples of that power in action. Where does abstract thinking really make a difference?
Well, its power shows up significantly in our core cognitive abilities. It's absolutely vital for critical analysis, meaning the ability to go beyond just the surface details, to challenge assumptions, evaluate evidence rigorously, analyze information deeply. It's essential for complex problem solving, especially those non-routine problems where the solution isn't just obvious.
Right.
It allows us to formulate theories, develop models, and as we've discussed, see that crucial bigger picture.
Right.
Think about analyzing huge data sets to find subtle trends, or developing new scientific theories in physics or economics, or cracking complex logical puzzles. All require sophisticated abstract reasoning.
And you mentioned cognitive flexibility earlier. Is that closely tied to abstract thinking?
Very much so. Abstract thinking enables cognitive flexibility. That's the capacity to adapt easily to new information, change your perspective when needed, maybe abandon old strategies that just aren't working anymore.
And approach problems from multiple different angles.
Exactly. It's that mental agility that comes from not being rigidly stuck in one single concrete viewpoint, but being able to mentally manipulate concepts and possibilities.
It also seems crucial for understanding how different ideas or things relate to each other, even if they look different on the surface.
Yes, that's relational understanding. Abstract thinking lets us grasp complex relationships between concepts that might seem unrelated superficially. This is key for using and understanding analogies.
Like recognizing that the relationship between, say, a key and a lock is analogous to a password and a computer.
Perfect example. or understanding that a teacher-student relationship shares similarities with a mentor-protege relationship. It's also fundamental for classification grouping items based on shared abstract characteristics, like apples and bananas are both fruit, and identifying outliers, what doesn't fit.
Seeing patterns?
It's all about recognizing patterns, not just in visible data, but in underlying structures and principles.
Now, this next point might surprise some people, but the sources also connect abstract thinking really deeply to our social and emotional lives.
They absolutely do. Abstract thinking is intimately linked to social and emotional intelligence. Well, it allows you to step outside your own immediate perspective and mentally simulate the viewpoints of others. Put yourself in their shoes.
Okay.
This helps you understand the underlying reasons for their behaviors, their motivations, their emotional reactions, which is vital for effective communication, navigating complex social situations, resolving conflicts peacefully.
And empathy.
Critically, it underpins the development of empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Because empathy requires you to abstract away from your own concrete experience and imagine the hypothetical internal state of someone else.
Right. It's not just seeing they're crying, it's abstractly understanding why they might be feeling sad based on their situation.
Exactly. And you can better predict how your actions might affect others by abstractly modeling their potential reactions. It aids social navigation.
That makes a lot of sense. What about creativity? Is that linked too?
Absolutely. Creativity is also strongly linked to abstract thought, engaging in creative activities like writing fiction.
Creating characters, plot lines.
Right. Composing music, drawing, painting. These often require you to generate novel ideas, combine concepts in new ways, build imaginary worlds, develop characters' complex internal lives, manipulate symbolic forms, all activities deeply rooted in abstract reasoning.
Okay, so abstract thinking gives us these incredible cognitive, social, and creative superpowers, basically. But we shouldn't forget concrete thinking. As we said, it's foundational and has its own power too, right?
Definitely. Reaffirming its importance, concrete thinking is indispensable. It's the necessary base. As one source highlights, you generally must be able to grasp the specific reality before you can effectively generalize or theorize about it.
You need the bricks before you build the wall.
Exactly. It's fundamental for processing specific details accurately and efficiently, which is critical in many tasks. And interestingly, concrete thinking can be particularly beneficial in certain challenging situations.
Like in processing difficult experiences. You touched on that briefly before.
Yes. Research mentioned in the sources, particularly concerning processing traumatic information, points to a surprising benefit of concrete thinking. Studies have found that individuals trained to use a more concrete approach when processing distressing information, like watching graphic film clips in a lab setting.
Oh,
They were less likely to experience intrusive memories of those clips later on.
really? Thinking more concretely reduced flashbacks.
That's what the evidence suggests. Focusing on the literal facts, the sensory details, the step-by-step sequence of events in a difficult situation, rather than abstracting its broader meaning, its implications for your identity, or the big why behind it. They can serve as a beneficial coping mechanism. It kind of anchors you in the immediate reality and may prevent that kind of abstract rumination that fuels distress and intrusive thoughts. It could potentially build resilience for people regularly exposed to traumatic events, like first responders or journalists.
That's a really powerful, practical application of deliberately using concrete thinking as a tool. So given all this power, both abstract and concrete, how can we consciously work to strengthen these abilities in ourselves? Especially abstract reasoning, which seems so crucial. What are some actionable takeaways from the sources?
The sources offer several practical overlapping strategies. One key theme is consciously developing critical thinking by asking how, not just what or why.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Instead of just accepting information at face value, consciously challenge assumptions. Ask probing questions like, what assumptions is the author making here? Or what specific evidence is provided for this claim?
Standard critical thinking, but how does the how part come in?
It connects back to that idea of avoiding abstract rumination.
Yeah.
Practice actively shifting from those abstract why questions, why did this happen to me, why do I feel this way, to concrete how questions. Like, how exactly did this sequence of events unfold? How can I break this problem down into manageable steps? How can I gather more specific information about this? This conscious shift between modes strengthens your ability to use thinking constructively, not just get stuck.
I like that, shifting from why to how. What else?
Second, actively apply abstract reasoning in your daily life. Look for opportunities. In your work or studies, actively seek out tasks that require identifying trends in data, understanding complex theories that connect disparate facts, or solving problems that require seeing patterns or relationships that aren't immediately obvious.
Be intentional about it.
Exactly. Try explaining complex ideas to others that forces you to abstract the core concepts and find helpful analogies.
Okay, makes sense. Number 3.
Engage in creative activities regularly. Drawing, writing, playing music, even engaging in structured creative problem-solving exercises.
Yeah.
These naturally exercise abstract thought. Creating characters, plot lines, musical structures, it all requires manipulating abstract concepts and symbols.
Good excuse to pick up a hobby. What's next?
Cultivate perspective-taking and empathy. Make a deliberate effort to understand situations from someone else's viewpoint, especially when there's disagreement or conflict. Actively ask yourself, given their situation and potential background, why might they be thinking or feeling this way?
That active mental simulation is a form of abstract reasoning, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Then reflect on your thinking process. Practice metacognition. After you solve a problem or learn something new, take a moment to reflect not just on the outcome, but how you got there.
Thinking about your thinking.
Right. What strategies did you use? Were you focused mainly on concrete details or abstract concepts? When did you need to switch between them? And seeking feedback from others on your approach can also provide valuable external perspective on your thinking habits.
That requires a bit of honesty with yourself.
It does. And finally, tying into what we'll discuss later, practice conscious bridging. Try applying that concrete pictorial abstract idea to something you're trying to learn yourself. Start with concrete examples, try to visualize them, and then work towards the abstract formula or concept. Or, if you're faced with a vague abstract goal, consciously try to ground it in concrete steps or a specific scenario.
These aren't just generic tips, are they? They seem directly tied back to strengthening the specific cognitive muscles we've been discussing.
Exactly. Thinking about these benefits and deliberately practicing these reframed skills can really enhance your ability to learn, solve a wider range of problems more effectively, improve your interactions with others by understanding them more deeply, and adapt more readily in this complex, always changing world.
So maybe think about where in your own week you could deliberately practice shifting your thinking lens, like consciously moving from why am I feeling so overwhelmed to how can I tackle this one specific task on my list right now.
That why versus how shift is a really powerful one to practice.
I'm definitely going to be more mindful of that now. Okay, so we've explored the power and how to build these skills, but what happens when our thinking goes sideways? Or when one style becomes unbalanced or is used inappropriately? What are the challenges?
That brings us to the potential pitfalls and limitations. And while abstract thinking is essential, an imbalanced or inappropriate reliance on it can definitely be detrimental. The most significant pitfall discussed in the sources is what's known as abstract rumination.
Right, getting stuck in those negative thought loops. We touched on this.
Yes, but specifically loops that are abstract in nature. Rumination that focuses on the why, the meaning, the implications, the broad negative labels associated with a problem or a bad experience, rather than the concrete specifics or actionable steps.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say after a setback at work, abstract rumination would involve dwelling on questions like, why am I always such a failure? Or what does this mean about my entire career? Or why do bad things always happen to me? Very broad, very negative, very why.
Instead of concrete thinking like, okay, how exactly did that meeting go wrong? What specific things were said? Or what specific steps can I take tomorrow to try and fix this? Or how can I approach this specific task differently next time?
Precisely. That type of abstract, non-specific why thinking about problems is incredibly unhelpful for actually finding solutions. It keeps your focus locked on the negative implications and these big, often unanswerable questions.
Without leading anywhere productive.
Right. It doesn't lead to any actionable insights or steps. It actually encourages mental avoidance of the actual problem by letting you stay in this realm of abstract worry. So the problem doesn't get addressed, and the worry just persists or even grows.
And research strongly links this style of abstract rumination to things like anxiety and depression.
Yes, it's considered a key factor in the development and maintenance of those conditions.
Yeah.
It's not just thinking a lot. It's this style of thinking, abstract, evaluative, focused on why me, instead of concrete, descriptive, focused on how to proceed.
Yeah.
That's the problem in harmful rumination.
Wow. And this understanding has actually led to treatments.
It has. Based on this idea, Concreteness training, CNT, has been developed and studied. It's a therapeutic intervention designed to help people shift their thinking style.
How does it work?
It trains individuals to deliberately think more concretely about their problems, their negative thoughts, or upsetting scenarios. The goal is to help them shift away from those abstract why questions towards concrete how questions.
So focusing on the specific sensory details of a situation, breaking down events into their precise sequence, developing step-by-step action plans.
Exactly those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And studies have shown that training individuals to adopt this more concrete approach to problem solving can significantly reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. It's a direct application of understanding the pitfalls of getting stuck in abstract thinking.
That's a really compelling demonstration of how understanding these thinking styles has real-world implications for mental well-being. What about challenges related to concrete thinking itself, especially in education you mentioned?
That's another area where the sources highlight potential pitfalls. While using concrete materials or examples is often crucial for introducing abstract concepts, particularly to beginners, the process isn't always straightforward or automatically effective.
That seems counterintuitive. Concrete things manipulate, shouldn't they always make abstract ideas clearer? Where does it go wrong?
Well, one major issue identified is distracting details. Sometimes, realistic or overly detailed concrete materials can actually draw a learner's attention to features that are irrelevant to the abstract concept being taught. This can inadvertently hinder understanding.
Can you give an example?
The source gives the example of using, say, brightly colored, realistically shaped apple counters to teach counting or basic arithmetic. A young child might get fascinated by the fact that they are apples, their specific color, their shape.
Instead of focusing purely on the number each counter represents, the abstract quantity.
Exactly. They focus on the appleness, not the oneness or two-ness. The rich, specific, concrete features of the object become the focus, creating perceptual noise that interferes with grasping the abstract mathematical idea the object is supposed to represent.
So sometimes simpler might be better.
It seems so. Simpler, blander materials like plain black disc counters or solid-colored fraction tiles or generic blocks might actually be more effective in some cases because they're less distracting. They allow the learner to more easily assign the intended abstract meaning, like quantity or fractional part, to them without getting sidetracked by irrelevant bells and whistles.
Okay, that makes sense. Distracting details. What's another challenge?
Another one mentioned is a lack of transfer. Just letting learners interact with concrete objects or models, even really cool ones, in an unstructured way doesn't guarantee that they'll automatically grasp the underlying abstract concept, or, crucially, that they'll be able to apply that concept in new situations, or without the concrete aid later on.
So playing with blocks doesn't automatically mean you understand geometry.
Not necessarily, no. The source mentions a specific study where young children were allowed to play freely with a scale model of a room. Just fun, unstructured playtime.
Okay.
That playtime actually harmed their ability to use the model symbolically, later on specifically, to use the model to find hidden objects in the real room, unless they received explicit guidance on the connection.
Wait, playing with the model first made it harder to use it as a symbol later. That's really surprising.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But the idea is that without explicit instruction or scaffolding to highlight the symbolic relationship, the children might have just encoded the scale model as a fun toy in itself, not as something that represented something else, the larger room.
They didn't build that mental bridge between the concrete object, the toy model, and the abstract concept, its symbolic relationship to the real room.
Exactly. And this really highlights the importance of structure, connection, and scaffolding when using concrete materials for learning abstract ideas.
So it's not just about providing the concrete material, it's about how it's presented and used.
Absolutely. The way concrete materials are chosen, how they are introduced, and how the learning environment is structured through scaffolding. That's crucial.
And scaffolding is?
It's that targeted support from a teacher or mentor. Asking specific, guiding questions. What do these 3 blocks represent in this problem? How is this diagram showing the same idea as the physical blocks? Modeling the thinking process aloud. Providing examples and non-examples. Facilitated discussions that push learners to articulate the connection between the concrete and the abstract.
It's described in one source as an art form, right? Finding that balance.
Yes, it's about providing just the right amount of support to help the learner build that by themselves, without doing the thinking for them. Too much scaffolding makes the learner passive. Too little leaves them unable to make the connection. Effective use of concrete materials requires careful pedagogical strategy to ensure the focus stays on the abstract concept they're meant to eliminate.
This makes a lot of sense. It's the intentional design of the learning experience that leverages the concrete to build towards the abstract, not just throwing objects at learners.
Precisely. Recognizing these potential downsides, the trap of unchecked abstract rumination or concrete learning tools used ineffectively helps you approach your own thinking and learning more constructively.
It prompts you to ask those useful filter questions. Am I getting stuck in why thinking when I need to focus on how? Am I struggling to learn from this concrete example because the connection to the bigger picture isn't clear enough yet?
Those are incredibly useful questions to ask yourself.
Okay, so we've seen the definitions, the complex path of development, the immense power, and the potential pitfalls. That brings us to the really practical part, bridging the divide. How do we actively and consciously connect abstract and concrete thinking in practice, in areas like learning, teaching, maybe even technology?
Bridging this gap is indeed a conscious strategy, not just something that happens automatically with age or development. It's actively employed in various fields, including education, and perhaps surprisingly, in cutting-edge artificial intelligence research.
Okay, let's start with education. How is this concrete to abstract bridge intentionally built in teaching? What are the strategies?
A very common and effective approach, particularly prominent in subjects like math mastery, is the concrete pictorial abstract CPA approach.
CPA, okay.
It's rooted in the work of developmental psychologists like Jerome Bruner. It provides a structured pathway for learners to move systematically, from interacting with and manipulating physical concrete objects like blocks, counters, specific measuring tools, to then seeing pictorial representations of those objects with the concepts like drawings, diagrams, charts, tally marks.
And finally, to understanding the purely abstract symbols, notations, or formulas that represent the concept.
Exactly, like numbers, mathematical symbols, plus equations, written definitions.
So first you count 3 actual apples, concrete. Then you might look at a picture of 3 apples with the numeral 3 next to it, pictorial. And finally, you just see and understand the abstract symbol 3, or use it in an equation like 3 + 2 = 5, abstract.
That's a perfect illustration. Or you might use specific fraction tiles, concrete, to understand parts of a whole, then see a pie chart divided into sections, pictorial, and finally work comfortably with the abstract symbols like 1/2 into 1 may equals 3/5.
And the key insight here is that this isn't just for little kids learning arithmetic, right?
Not at all. That's crucial. When introducing a challenging new concept for learners of any age, it's often beneficial to cycle back through these stages. Maybe start with a concrete example or a visual representation to ground the abstract idea before diving into pure theory or notation. Flexible movement between these stages is really key for deep understanding, especially when things get tough.
And you mentioned scaffolding earlier as the art form that helps bridge the CPA gap too.
Yes, scaffolding is absolutely essential in the CPA approach. And just more generally, whenever you're trying to connect concrete experiences to abstract understanding, it's that targeted support we talked about.
From a teacher, a mentor, maybe even well-designed learning materials.
Exactly. Support that helps the learner make that conceptual leap. Asking those specific guiding questions. What do these 3 blocks represent in this problem? How is this diagram showing the same idea as the blocks? Modeling the thinking process aloud. Providing examples and non-examples. Facilitating discussions that prompt learners to articulate their understanding and make the connections explicit.
It's about providing just enough support to help the learner build the bridge themselves without just giving them the answer.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance.
That targeted guidance seems critical. The sources also highlight another strategy in education, grounding abstract goals in concrete scenarios. How does that work?
This is a really powerful way to make abstract educational objectives feel tangible and actionable, especially for teachers when they're planning lessons or curriculum. The example given in one source describes taking very abstract, sometimes quite vague, goals like teaching 21st century skills or non-routine cognitive skills, terms that can mean different things to different people.
Yeah, they can feel a bit fuzzy.
Exactly. And grounding them in a rich, concrete case study or project. The specific example used was a complex project where students have to design an outer space colony.
Designing an outer space colony. Okay, that sounds concrete. How does that make abstract skills like critical thinking concrete?
Well, the case study involves a whole series of concrete tasks students must complete as part of this project. They need to conduct research on colonization and ecology, perhaps using digital sources. They need to synthesize that information. They need to design their colony based on evidence and specific criteria. They need to create presentations to share and justify their design. Maybe they even evaluate each other's work based on rubrics.
Ah, I see. So the abstract skills like research, synthesis, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, they're no longer just abstract terms on a curriculum checklist. By grounding them in the concrete tasks involved in designing the colony, teachers can think specifically about how students will demonstrate and develop those skills within the context of the project.
Precisely. It shifts the focus from debating abstract definitions like, what does critical thinking really mean? To concrete planning like, okay, how will students use critical thinking skills specifically to evaluate the credibility of the digital sources they find during the research phase of this colony project?
It makes the abstract goals tangible and provides a concrete framework for designing the instruction and assessing whether the students actually learn the skills.
Yes, it helps both teachers and students make that crucial connection between the abstract skill and the concrete application.
That's a brilliant way to bridge the gap for both teaching and learning. Now, you mentioned this bridging is even happening in the world of artificial intelligence. That seems surprising for machines supposedly built on pure logic and data.
It does seem a bit counterintuitive at first, but recent research is showing some fascinating parallels between how humans can be prompted to think more abstractly or concretely, and how advanced large language models, LLMs like Llama 2, can actually be steered in similar ways.
You can steer a machine's thinking style. How? With the prompt.
Essentially, yes. The researchers explored this using a prompting strategy that's conceptually similar to that why versus how distinction we discussed regarding rumination and coping.
Okay.
They designed abstract prompts that directed the LLM to deduce the ultimate reasons or the high-level goals behind a task, asking it things conceptually like, why do you do what you do? Linking its actions to broad objectives.
And the concrete prompts.
The concrete prompts directed the model to focus on specific strategies, steps, or mechanisms for achieving an objective, asking it conceptually, how will you do this? Focusing on the concrete process, the sequence of actions.
And did it work? Could they actually influence the model's output based on whether they prompted it with why versus how?
Yes. The findings indicated that these LLMs can be effectively steered towards generating responses that align more with either an abstract, why-focused, or a concrete, how-focused thinking style, depending on how they're prompted.
That's really interesting.
It is. And interestingly, the research also suggested that LLMs, maybe based on their current training data and methods, might have an inherent bias towards concrete thinking patterns.
Why would that be?
Well, perhaps because the vast majority of their training data consists of specific examples, concrete facts, and maybe step-by-step instructions found online or in books. They're trained heavily on concrete instances.
So, trained on concrete examples, they tend to default to concrete responses. Makes sense.
But the key finding, beyond just steering the style, was this concept they called construal fit.
Construal fit?
Yeah. The study found that matching the LLM's prompted thinking level, abstract or concrete, to the cognitive requirements of the specific task it was performing could actually lead to improved performance on that task.
Can you give an example?
Sure. For tasks that seem to require understanding underlying meaning, broad themes, or making generalizations like sentiment analysis, where you need to grasp the overall abstract feeling of a text, prompting the LLM with an abstract why-style prompt tended to work better.
Okay. And for concrete tasks?
For tasks requiring detailed step-by-step execution or focusing on specific linguistic features like certain types of natural language inference problems where precision matters, a concrete how-style prompt seemed to be more effective.
So telling the AI why something matters or the big picture goal helps it on abstract tasks, while telling it how to do something or the exact steps helps it on concrete tasks. It's like giving it the right mental frame for the job.
Precisely. This research demonstrates that this fundamental human distinction between abstract and concrete thinking isn't just some quirk of our own biological minds. It's proving to be a relevant dimension even when we interact with sophisticated artificial systems.
And understanding this could potentially help us design better AI in the future, or just use the AI we have now more effectively.
Potentially both. It could help us design AI that can better switch between these modes, prompt existing AI more effectively for specific kinds of tasks, and maybe even gain more insight into the underlying cognitive processes, or lack thereof, within these models.
That's truly fascinating that these fundamental human thinking styles are showing up and proving relevant even in AI. So zooming back out, What does all this mean for you, our listener, in terms of consciously bridging this divide in your own life? How can we apply these ideas?
Well, these examples from education and AI really show that consciously bridging abstract and concrete isn't just a developmental phase we go through. It's a powerful active strategy we can use throughout our lives.
So how can you apply this?
Ask yourself, if you're grappling with a complex abstract concept, maybe a difficult theory, or a vague goal, can you deliberately try to ground it? Can you find concrete examples, specific scenarios, or break it down into structured, step-by-step approaches? Maybe even try using that CPA idea on yourself. Find a concrete instance, try to visualize it, then work towards the abstract rule or definition.
And conversely?
Conversely, if you feel like you're getting lost in the weeds, bogged down in concrete details or endless tasks, can you consciously step back? Can you ask about the why? What's the bigger picture here? What are the underlying principles or the pattern that connects all these details? Doing that can help you find meaning, develop a better strategy, or just regain perspective.
It's really about adding versatility to your cognitive toolkit, isn't it? Knowing when to use the microscope for the details, when to use the wide-angle lens for the landscape.
And crucially, how to move smoothly and deliberately between them. It's about becoming a more conscious and flexible thinker.
Well, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground today in this deep dive. We started by trying to clearly define that fundamental difference between abstract and concrete thinking.
Right, looking at both the philosophical view, abstract objects derived from shared properties, and the psychological view, abstract thought, as a process of generalization and conceptualization.
Then we delved into the complex story of how these abilities develop. We looked at Piaget's foundational model, that stage-by-stage progression from concrete to abstract.
But we also introduced that surprising alternative perspective from Simons and Keel, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, in some domains, abstract frameworks might actually precede concrete knowledge, challenging that traditional linear view.
We definitely explored the incredible power these thinking styles give us, everything from enhancing critical analysis, problem solving, and cognitive flexibility,
to enabling relational understanding, fostering social and emotional intelligence like empathy, and fueling creativity.
And we also saw the specific, sometimes surprising benefits of concrete thinking too, like its potential role in processing traumatic information more effectively.
But we didn't shy away from the pitfalls. We identified the dangers of getting stuck in abstract rumination and how that's linked to anxiety and depression.
And the challenges of using concrete learning materials, effectively how distracting details or a lack of structure and scaffolding can actually hinder learning if not done carefully.
Finally, we looked at those practical ways we can consciously bridge the gap between abstract and concrete. We saw how structured approaches like CPA and grounding abstract goals in concrete scenarios are used deliberately in education.
And how even in cutting-edge AI research, understanding and prompting for abstract versus concrete thinking levels is proving relevant for optimizing performance.
So it seems abundantly clear, doesn't it? Neither abstract nor concrete thinking is inherently superior. One isn't better than the other.
They're complementary, essential tools in your cognitive arsenal.
Exactly. Effective learning, robust problem solving, meaningful interaction, navigating complex systems. All of it seems to rely on your ability to know when to focus intently on the tangible details, when to zoom out to see the abstract connections and principles, and crucially, how to move smoothly and deliberately between these two powerful modes of thought.
So, here's a thought to leave you with, something maybe to mull over. Consider how much of our modern world think about the complex algorithms running the internet. Global financial systems, abstract scientific theories like quantum mechanics or relativity. How much of it is built upon multiple intricate layers of abstraction?
It really is abstraction all the way down in some sense.
Yet, every single layer of this abstract world ultimately relies on a foundation of concrete reality. Physical servers and data centers, tangible resources being traded, observable phenomena and experiments, specific measurements being taken.
The abstract rests on the concrete.
So the question for you is, how can you, now armed with a perhaps deeper understanding of both abstract and concrete thinking and the ways they connect and contrast, how can you more effectively navigate, understand, and maybe even contribute to a world that constantly demands you operate at multiple levels of abstraction while still remaining grounded in the tangible reality?
That's a big question.
It is. What new insights or possibilities open up for you when you become more deliberate about which thinking lens you choose to use, or how you consciously blend them together depending on the challenge right in front of you?